The letter arrived on a Thursday in late August, forwarded twice before it found me, the kind of mail that looks important before you even open the envelope because someone went to the trouble of tracking down your current address through 3 old ones. My name is Nathan Cole, and at the time I had no idea I had any family left in Alaska. My mother's side of the family was a subject she rarely discussed, a string of relatives scattered across the interior who had drifted out of contact decades before I was born. So when a law office in Fairbanks wrote to inform me that my great-uncle Elias Cole had passed away at the age of 91 and had left me his cabin and the surrounding 80 acres of land, I read the letter 3 times trying to figure out if it was a scam. It was not a scam. I confirmed that with a phone call 2 days later to a lawyer named Whitfield, an older-sounding man with a slow, careful way of speaking that I would come to recognize, by the end of our conversation, as the voice of someone choosing his words with more caution than the topic seemed to require. I asked him what I was inheriting exactly. He told me 80 acres of forested land in the interior, about 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, with a cabin on it that Elias had built himself in the early 1960s and had lived in continuously alone for over 60 years. I asked if there was anything else I should know. There was a pause on the line long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call had not dropped. Then he said, "I'll have some paperwork for you when you arrive. Your uncle was specific about wanting it handed over in person." I flew into Fairbanks 3 weeks later, in mid-September, with the leaves already turning and the air carrying that first sharp edge that tells you winter in Alaska does not wait politely for the calendar. I was 31 years old, between jobs after a layoff from a logistics company, recently out of a relationship that had ended the way most do, slowly and then all at once. I had nothing keeping me anywhere in particular. An inherited cabin in the Alaskan interior sounded, if nothing else, like a place to go be alone for a while and figure out what came next. Whitfield's office was a small suite above a hardware store on the edge of downtown Fairbanks. He was older than his voice had suggested, maybe 70, with the weathered look of a man who had spent enough time in this state to be shaped by it. He shook my hand, offered me coffee I did not want, and slid a thick folder across his desk. Inside the folder was the deed, a hand-drawn map of the property, a set of keys on a length of braided leather cord, and a single sheet of paper typed on what looked like an actual typewriter, the ink slightly uneven in places where the ribbon had been running low. The heading at the top read, "For whoever comes after me." I asked Whitfield what it was before I started reading it. He said your uncle wrote that himself about 10 years ago and updated it twice since. He asked me to make sure that whoever inherited the cabin read it before setting foot on the property. Not after, before. I read it standing right there in his office. Rule 1, never go past the tree line marker on the northern boundary, regardless of what you hear coming from that direction. Rule 2. The root cellar door is to remain padlocked at all times. If you find the padlock open or missing, do not go down. Leave the property and do not return until you have replaced the lock. Rule 3. If you hear someone calling your name from outside the cabin between dusk and dawn, do not answer and do not go to the window to look. Rule 4. There is a trail behind the cabin that is not on the map. Do not follow it, even in daylight, even if it looks like it leads somewhere worth seeing. Rule 5. Leave a bowl of something outside the door every evening before dark. It does not matter what. It matters that you do it every single night without exception. Rule 6. If you ever see a second set of footprints leading to the cabin door that do not match anyone you know, do not follow them to see where they came from. Follow them only far enough to confirm they lead away again. Rule 7. The cabin has 2 windows on the back wall. There used to be 3. Do not ask why, and do not try to find where the third one used to be. I looked up at Whitfield after finishing it. I asked him if my uncle had been in his later years of sound mind. It seemed like the polite way of asking if Elias had been losing his grip on reality when he wrote this. Whitfield considered the question seriously, which surprised me. He said, "I knew your uncle for almost 30 years. Handled his affairs, helped him with supply contracts, the occasional legal matter. He was sharp until the end, sharper than most men half his age." He paused. "He was also the most careful man I ever met about that property. He never missed putting that bowl out, not once in all the years I knew him, not even the winter he broke his hip and had to crawl to the door to do it." I asked him if he believed the rules meant anything. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe your uncle survived 60 years alone in the interior, in a part of the state most people would not last 60 days in, and he believed those rules were the reason why. I am not in a position to tell you he was wrong." I drove out to the property 2 days later in a truck I had rented in Fairbanks, the folder on the passenger seat, the keys on their leather cord hanging from the rearview mirror where I had absently looped them while loading my gear. The drive took most of the day, the last 20 miles on a gravel road that gradually narrowed and roughened until it was barely more than 2 ruts through the spruce. The cabin appeared at the end of it the way things appear in that country, suddenly, the trees opening up into a small clearing, with the structure sitting at the center of it like it had grown there rather than been built. It was a good cabin, solid log construction, a steep metal roof built to shed heavy snow, a covered porch along the front. My uncle had clearly known what he was doing when he built it. There was something almost peaceful about the clearing in the late afternoon light, golden and still, the kind of place that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be on the surface, a hunting cabin, a hermit's retreat, an old man's quiet life lived out in the woods. I sat in the truck for a while before getting out, the folder in my lap, rereading the list. I want to be honest about my state of mind at that point. I did not believe the rules described anything real. I believed I had inherited a remote cabin from an old man who had spent decades alone in the wilderness and had developed, the way people sometimes do in isolation, a set of private rituals that had calcified into something he treated as deadly serious. I thought the rules were probably superstition, maybe grief over some specific incident decades ago that he had never fully explained even to himself, dressed up in the language of instruction. I decided to follow them anyway. Partly out of respect for a man I had never met but who had apparently thought enough of family, of bloodline, of whoever might come after him, to leave precise written guidance instead of nothing at all. Partly because 80 acres of interior Alaska 40 miles from the nearest help is not a place where ignoring an old man's careful instructions seemed like a wise way to start. I unloaded my gear before dark. I found the bowl Whitfield had mentioned sitting on a shelf just inside the door, an old chipped ceramic thing, clearly used for exactly this purpose for a very long time, the bottom worn smooth in a way that suggested decades of nightly handling. I did not have anything specific prepared that first evening. I found a can of stew in the supplies I had brought, opened it, and set half of it in the bowl. I carried it outside and set it on the small wooden stand beside the porch steps, a stand that I now understood had been built for exactly that purpose, worn gray with weather, positioned at a careful distance from the door, close enough to be convenient and far enough to suggest deliberate thought about exactly how far was appropriate. I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself I felt ridiculous. I did not feel ridiculous by morning. The bowl was empty. I want to be precise about what that means because my first instinct, standing on the porch in the cold gray light of my first Alaska morning, was the obvious one. An animal had eaten it. A fox, a marten, something opportunistic that had found an easy meal sitting in a clearing. That is the explanation that makes sense. That is the explanation I told myself while I stood there looking at the bowl. But the bowl was not knocked over. It was not dragged from its position on the stand. It sat exactly where I had left it, perfectly centered, completely empty, without a single mark or scratch on the ceramic to suggest an animal's teeth or claws had been anywhere near it. I told myself raccoons were careful eaters. I told myself a lot of things that first week. The first real test of the rules came on my 5th night. I had settled into something resembling a routine. Firewood during the day, exploring the immediate area around the cabin with the map my uncle had drawn, careful to stay well clear of the northern tree line and the unmarked trail behind the cabin that the rules had specifically mentioned. I put the bowl out every evening before the light failed. I locked the root cellar door, which I had found exactly where the map indicated, set into a low mound about 30 yards from the cabin, secured with a heavy padlock that looked old enough to have been there since the cabin was built. On the 5th night I was lying in bed, the cabin dark except for the dying glow of the wood stove, when I heard my name, Nathan, clear, distinct. Coming from somewhere outside, north of the cabin, in a voice that had a quality I cannot fully describe except to say that it sounded almost right, almost like a voice I should recognize. Pitched somewhere between male and female in a way that should have been impossible and somehow was not. Every instinct in my body told me to get up and look out the window. The rules said not to. I lay there in the dark with my heart going hard against my ribs, and I did not move. It called my name 3 more times over the course of maybe 10 minutes, each time from a slightly different position, as though it was moving around the cabin in a wide, slow circle. I lay still and silent and did not answer and did not look. It stopped sometime after midnight. I did not sleep again that night. I want to tell you that I considered seriously packing up the next morning and driving back to Fairbanks and never coming back. I did consider it. I sat at the small kitchen table with my coffee going cold and looked at the rules taped to the inside of the cabinet door, where I had put them after my first night, and I thought very hard about whether 80 acres and an old man's careful instructions were worth what I had just experienced. What kept me there in the end was something Whitfield had said in his office. He survived 60 years alone in the interior. He believed those rules were the reason why. If the rules worked, then I had just proven on my fifth night that they were not superstition. Something outside that cabin had called my name in a voice built specifically to sound almost human, almost familiar, almost worth answering. And it had stopped eventually because I had not given it what it wanted. That felt like information worth having. It also felt like a reason to stay and learn the rest of what the rules were protecting me from, rather than running from a thing I did not understand back to a city where I would spend the rest of my life wondering. The second incident came in October, after the first real snow. I woke before dawn to find the root cellar padlock sitting on the ground beside the mound, open, the hasp swung free, the door itself standing ajar by perhaps 6 inches. I did not go down. The rule was clear, and I followed it without hesitation this time, the memory of the voice still close enough in my mind that obedience came easily. I packed a bag, took the truck, and drove the 40 miles into the nearest town, where I spent 2 nights in a motel room turning the situation over in my head and trying to understand what could open a padlock from the inside. When I returned, the door was closed again. The padlock was back in place, snapped shut, hanging exactly where it should have been. I did not ask why. The rules had told me not to. I bought a second, heavier padlock at the hardware store in town and added it to the door as a redundant measure that I suspected would not matter at all if whatever opened the first one decided to try again, but that made me feel marginally better regardless. The third incident, and the one that has stayed with me longest, happened in November. I was out checking a trapline I had set along the creek that ran through the southern part of the property, well clear of any boundary the rules had warned me about, when I came back to the cabin in the late afternoon and found a second set of footprints in the fresh snow leading up to my door. Bare feet, in snow that had fallen that morning, in temperatures well below freezing. The prints came from the direction of the northern tree line, crossed the clearing in a straight, unhurried line, and stopped at my porch steps. My own boot prints, leaving that morning, were clearly visible nearby, undisturbed since I had made them. These new prints had been made sometime after I left. I remembered the rule: follow them only far enough to confirm they lead away again. I forced myself to look past the porch, scanning the snow for any continuation of the trail leading away from the cabin in another direction. It was there, the same bare footprints, continuing past the porch steps, curving around the side of the cabin and heading back toward the tree line, retracing almost exactly the path they had arrived on. They led away. Whatever had stood at my door while I was out checking traps had left again. I went inside and did not sleep with the lights off for the rest of that week. I called Whitfield not long after that, mostly because I needed to hear another human voice that understood what I was dealing with. I described the footprints. I asked him directly what he thought was out there. He was quiet for a long moment on the line, the kind of quiet that told me he was deciding how much to tell me. Then he said, "Your uncle never told me exactly what he believed it was. He told me once, years ago, after a few drinks, that he thought it had been there long before he built the cabin, that the rules were not really about keeping it away. He said you cannot keep something like that away from land it has always considered its own. He said the rules were about being a good enough guest that it left you alone. I asked him what happens if you stop being a good guest. He said, I don't know. Your uncle never broke a single rule in 60 years that I'm aware of." He paused. "I think that's probably the whole point. I am still at the cabin. It has been almost a year now. I have not missed a night with the bowl. I have not gone near the northern tree line. I have not followed the unmarked trail behind the cabin, though I think about it more than I would like to admit, the way you think about anything you have been specifically told not to do. I keep both padlocks on the root cellar door, and I check them every morning out of habit now rather than necessity. The voice has called my name 11 more times since that first night. I have never answered. I have never looked out the window. I have gotten better over the months at lying still in the dark and waiting for it to stop, though I do not think I will ever get good at it the way my uncle apparently did. I found his journals eventually, stacked in a trunk at the back of the cabin's single-bedroom closet, decades of them, going back to the year the cabin was built. I have been reading through them slowly, a few entries at a time, partly because the handwriting is difficult and partly because I am not always sure I am ready for what I will find in them. What I have learned so far is this: the rules were not always 7. In the earliest journals there were only 3, and they changed and grew over the decades as my uncle learned. Sometimes through close calls he described in spare, unflinching detail exactly what this land required of the people who lived on it. I think eventually there will be an 8th rule. Something I will learn the way he learned each of his, through an experience I will be lucky to survive and luckier still to understand. I do not know what it will be. I only know that when it comes, I will write it down, the same way he did, on a sheet of paper that will eventually find its way to whoever comes after me, because that is what this land asks of the people who live on it. Not ownership, not mastery, just careful, patient obedience to rules that were never explained, written by people who learned the hard way so that the next person would not have to. I put the bowl out again tonight, before the light failed, the way I have every night for almost a year now. I do not know what eats from it. I have decided, the way my uncle apparently decided 60 years before me, that some questions are better left unasked, as long as the answer keeps showing up empty every morning and the footprints keep leading away again, and my name, when it is called in the dark, is never anything I have to answer.